Hey guys, GPA Jesus here. In this video we'll cover aggregate demand, the definition of it, the reason for its downward slope, its determinants, and the GPA Jesus acronym for memorizing it.
As you'll start to see, the amount of money consumers are able or willing to spend greatly affects aggregate demand, and you'll see that a lot throughout this video.
So first off, what is aggregate demand? It might sound a little bit scary.
GPA Jesus, what does aggregate mean? I don't speak English very well.
Aggregate just means total or sum of. And when it's placed next to demand, it means the total demand or the sum of demand, which follows along with the definition, which aggregate demand means the sum of demand for finished goods and services in an economy. And if you think about it, the total demand could be measured by the money spent on goods and services in an economy. What does that sound similar to? The expenditures approach. We'll often write aggregate demand is equal to G plus I plus C plus X, as aggregate demand is made up of all the money spent by consumers, businesses, other countries, and the government. Seems quite simple, right? It's basically demand but just blown up for macroeconomics to include everything. Let's first discuss why aggregate demand slopes downward, and there are 3 reasons why. Note that changes in these effects can change the elasticity of aggregate demand, making it steeper, flatter, though you don't really need to deal with elasticity in this unit. So the first thing we cover is the wealth effect, which essentially says that as price levels increase, or basically just prices, since we're talking about the levels of price, so prices generally, if they increase, which is known as inflation, the wealth of consumers decrease. This is because as prices go up, everything gets more expensive, so your purchasing power decreases, and you're going to spend less money if you have less money to spend.
This concept appears a lot in this video, so be sure to understand it.
This means that at higher price levels, aggregate demand is low, and then at lower price levels, aggregate demand is higher, which this helps explain the downward slope. So the next reason we have is the interest rate effect. As the price level increases again, or inflation increases, consumers will panic and take their money out of banks. And if many people do that, then the bank will have a lot less money to loan out. As when you put money into a bank, they use that money to loan out to other people, but then they won't have any money to loan out if no one gives them anything to use. So then the bank will have less money, and what they'll have to do to counter that is to increase interest rates. This results in consumers taking less money out to make big purchases, or businesses less willing to do borrowing, and so aggregate demand will fall. So as we can see at lower price levels, aggregate demand is pretty high, as the bank has a lot of money and will offer lower interest rates. However, when they don't have so much money, then they're going to charge high interest rates, so borrowing will be low, and so will aggregate demand. Finally, there's the net exports effect. So let's take Venezuela with their super high prices and inflation. The relative price for foreign imports will be much more attractive than their expensive domestic imports, which will be less in demand due to its higher prices. Remember that net exports is exports minus imports. So if imports increases and exports decreases, then your net exports will be a smaller number, if not even more negative. So now you know why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, but you also need to know what can shift the aggregate demand curve, otherwise known as the determinants. As the messiah of acronyms, I made one called the X Crew, which takes the determinant of the textbook that this channel is based on, which is the Krugman textbook, and makes acronyms into an easy to memorize mnemonic. The textbook has some more specific terms, so we'll go over those, but when in doubt, just use these. The first we have is delta X, or a change in net export. We've already discussed how aggregate demand will shift from a change in net exports, as from here. For example, if net exports increase, then aggregate demand will shift to the right. And if net exports decreases, then aggregate demand will shift to the left. So the second one we have is C, a change in a stock of capital. This one mostly affects investment expenditures from this equation. What it essentially says is that a firm's incentive to spend is based on how much physical capital they own. If their stock of capital decreases, then their spending will increase. What does this really mean? If a firm has a ton of physical capital, they will feel less of a need to spend more on capital. So just know that if the current stock of physical capital is small, then aggregate demand will shift to the right as firms are incentivized to spend more. But if they have a lot of physical capital, then aggregate demand will shift to the left. Now we have R for change in government regulations. I swear I've used R for regulations like 50 times now. This determinant shows the strong influence governments have over the market, or at least the US government. And this determinant spreads into two policies you need to memorize. First is fiscal policy, next is monetary policy. Let's go through fiscal policy first. So fiscal policy you will learn much more in depth later in this unit, but essentially fiscal policy is a government action on government spending or on taxes. If the government increases government spending or decreases tax rates, which these two actions both have the same effect, aggregate demand will shift to the right as there's more money flowing through the economy. If the government decides to cut spending and raise taxes, then aggregate demand will shift to the left as there's less money being spent overall.
As you can see, a lot of this has to do with how much a consumer is willing to spend.
And then there's also monetary policy. If the government decides to cut spending or increase tax rates, people will have less money to spend and aggregate demand will shift to the left. And then there's monetary policy. This is also discussed later on in the course, but for now, you just need to know that the Federal Reserve can control the amount of money circulating through an economy. If they increase the money supply, everyone will have more money, and so aggregate demand will shift to the right or increase. And reducing the money supply will have the opposite effect, as people have less money to spend, so aggregate demand will go down. So next we have a change in expectations, which falls into the category of consumer or investment spending. If consumers or businesses expect a high future inflation, they will buy more goods now, since goods will be more expensive in the future, so they'll be paying more in the future, and this will increase aggregate demand. So finally, we have a change in wealth, which strongly relates to consumer spending. Notice this is different from the wealth effect. This mostly concerns with the real value of household assets. And basically what it revolves around is consumers will spend more if their household assets are worth more, since essentially they have more wealth. And so if household assets go up, then aggregate demand will also go up. If their assets go down, then aggregate demand will go down with it. So those are essentially all the determinants of aggregate demand. However, this seems quite confusing, and so we have a GPAG, this acronym that I already mentioned earlier. So the determinant for aggregate demand is X-crew. This comes from combining all of the main letters from the acronyms. We first have X for net exports, C for capital, R for regulations, E for expectations, W for wealth. It spells out X crew. Imagine the X-Men, but just better.
And also non-gender discriminatory.
And instead it's a Star Trek crew traveling on a spaceship, rather than some like dog with claws. However, if you're just cramming don't spend the time to memorize all of this. There's really no need. What you really need to just know, and you already pretty much know this, is G plus C plus I plus X, which is just the expenditures approach pretty much. And if you're given a question that changes any of these variables, aggregate demand will shift. And if you just know this part, you're pretty much set for most of the aggregate demand questions on determinants. So that's essentially all you really need to know for aggregate demand. Here's a short summary. The definition of aggregate demand is basically the total demand for goods and services in an economy. And you can get this by just adding all the spending, just C plus I plus G plus X, which you've learned last unit from the expenditures approach. There are three reasons for the aggregate demand's downward slope. The wealth effect, which consumers' purchasing power decreases, so they'll spend less. Interest rate effect, which comes from banks running out of money, which comes from people taking out too much money from the bank and forcing them to increase interest rates, which will decrease borrowing and overall spending. And the net exports effect, where imports are more attractive than the exports for a country as inflation increases. And remember the determinants, you can just remember X crew of net exports, a change in stock of physical capital, a change in government regulations, a change in expectations, and a change in wealth. So that's it. I'll do another video later devoted to aggregate demand and supply practice in the future and some actual questions, but this video is already getting too long since aggregate demand is really quite simple. Join my Discord and go on my amazing incomplete website. That'll help you dominate every unit test. GP Jesus out, I died for your grades.